Did you know that some of the biggest stars of Hollywood's golden age carried secrets that no studio dared to publish in fan magazines? We're not talking about secret affairs or hidden past. We're talking about body odor, bad breath, and questionable hygiene. Yep, behind the glamour, these screen legends had some seriously stinky reputations. Let's take a deep breath and dive into a lesser-known, slightly nose-wrinkling side of old Hollywood. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling heartthrob who set the standard for on-screen charm and adventure. But behind those action-packed roles and dashing good looks, there was something off. And it wasn't just his roguish behavior, it was his smell. Those who got close enough often noticed something pungent lingering in the air. A mix of stale sweat, unwashed clothes, and a hint of whatever party he'd attended the night before. Flynn had a reputation for ignoring the basics of personal hygiene. Taking regular showers, that was optional. Changing clothes between shoots, not always a priority. In fact, some people who worked with him claimed he thought bathing too often was unnecessary, even a bit too refined for his rugged image. Whether that was just bravado or laziness, it didn't stop the whispers. While he was alive, studios kept a tight lid on anything that could tarnish his image. But behind the scenes, crew members, makeup artists, and even co-stars shared the same complaint. Flynn's body odor was hard to ignore. One particularly infamous incident came later in his life when he showed up at a social event in Vancouver, unshaven, in rumpled clothes, and reportedly smelling like he hadn't bathed in days. Witnesses described him as a shell of the man he used to be, not because of his appearance, but because of the strong, unpleasant aura that surrounded him. It wasn't just a bad day, this was a pattern. Stories from those final years paint a clear picture. Errol Flynn, despite being one of the most magnetic stars of the golden age, had a serious aversion to soap and water. And while his charisma might have lit up the screen, it couldn't mask what people remembered most behind the scenes. The unmistakable odor of a man who simply didn't care to clean up. Clark Gable had the looks, the voice, the charm, and according to many who worked with him, some of the worst breath in Hollywood. Behind his smooth lines and confident smirk lay a lesser-known reputation. One whispered across sets and passed down in hushed tones. Gable's breath was so foul, it made kissing scenes more like a punishment than a romantic moment. It all came to a head during the filming of Gone with the Wind. Vivien Leigh, who played Scarlett O'Hara and shared several close scenes with Gable, reportedly complained more than once about his breath. Though nothing ever made it to the headlines, studios made sure of that. The murmurs backstage were loud enough to reach legendary status. So what was behind it? According to those close to the actor, Gable had lost several teeth early in life and wore dentures that didn't quite fit right. Combine that with the less than stellar dental care of the 1930s and 40s, and you've got the perfect storm for chronic halitosis. The problem wasn't just minor morning breath. Insiders described it as strong enough to clear a room. Crew members claimed it was especially noticeable during dialogue scenes or intimate moments on set. Co-stars allegedly braced themselves before certain takes, and makeup artists did what they could. Mints, mouthwash, and all kinds of tricks. But nothing seemed to last more than a few minutes. Interestingly, none of this was ever publicly confirmed during his lifetime. Gable was the king, after all, and the studios had a kingdom to protect. But as time passed and those who worked with him began to write memoirs and give interviews, the story of his infamous breath spread, becoming one of those enduring legends of Golden Age Hollywood. So while Clark Gable may be remembered for his iconic role as Rhett Butler, there's another side of him that's rarely seen, or rather, smelled. Behind the confident stare and timeless charm was a man with a dental issue that made even the brightest stars take a step back. Jean Harlow lit up the screen with her iconic platinum blonde hair and dazzling smile. She was the very definition of old Hollywood glamour, flawless in every frame, seductive with just a glance. But behind the perfection, there was a problem no amount of powder or perfume could cover. Jean Harlow had a smell, a very strong one. Her striking appearance hid a reality that only those close to her knew. Harlow suffered from chronic kidney disease, a condition that, especially back then, had very few treatment options. It wasn't something she could control. As her kidneys struggled to filter toxins from her body, it resulted in a persistent body odor, one described as sharp, acrid, and similar to ammonia. Despite her efforts, and she tried everything from heavy perfumes to frequent bathing, the smell lingered. Studio makeup artists, costume handlers, and even co-stars would notice. There are accounts from behind the scenes that describe makeup rooms being aired out after her sessions, and close-up scenes that became a challenge for actors working alongside her. But let's be clear, this wasn't a matter of neglect. Harlow was meticulous about her appearance. The issue was entirely medical, The cruel irony was that in an industry obsessed with perfection, Jean's body was quietly betraying her, and no one dared speak about it publicly. The studio did what studios did best. They protected her image at all costs. No magazine would ever hint at anything negative. But off the record, executives at MGM were well aware and reportedly went to great lengths to manage the situation. Controlled lighting, limited close-ups, and altered shooting schedules, all carefully designed to keep the myth alive. Sadly, Jean Harlow died young, and her struggles remained hidden for decades. Only much later in memoirs and biographies did the details emerge. And while the gossip might focus on her scent, the truth reveals something far more tragic. A woman battling a serious illness while still giving everything she had to the spotlight. She remains unforgettable. But for those who stood beside her, it wasn't just the glow of her fame they remembered. It was also the unmistakable scent of suffering beneath the glamour. Marilyn Monroe was the embodiment of Hollywood beauty, a walking fantasy wrapped in silk, diamonds, and that unmistakable, breathy voice. But beyond the spotlight and the soft focus lenses was a very different version of Marilyn, one that her housekeepers and inner circle knew all too well. She was, quite simply, a mess. Multiple house staff over the years quit citing the same reasons. Monroe rarely bathed, often wore the same clothes for days, and left heaps of dirty dishes and laundry scattered throughout her home. Allegedly, she'd eat in bed, then push leftover food under the sheets, where it would stay until someone else discovered it. She was known to walk around the house in stained or unwashed clothing, and often didn't bother to clean up after herself, even during visits from friends. One biographer, David Brett, didn't hold back in his descriptions. He claimed Monroe was flatulent, messy, and had a habit of not wearing underwear, which, while a quirky detail to some, added to the perception of someone detached from daily routines of cleanliness. More surprisingly, Clark Gable, yes, that Clark Gable, reportedly refused to date her in part because of her hygiene. Coming from someone with his own infamous halitosis, that says something. But this wasn't just laziness or diva behavior. Many who've studied Monroe's life point to the possibility that these habits were tied to her struggles with anxiety, depression, and possibly irritable bowel syndrome, a condition which could have added both to her discomfort and her avoidance of certain routines. In modern terms, this might be seen as a coping mechanism. At the time, it was something no one dared talk about openly. Despite all that, Marilyn's image stayed spotless, literally. The public saw the polished goddess, not the woman who sometimes refused to shower for days or let food rot in her bedroom. That side of her only came to light decades later, through tell-all books and interviews with those who had once quietly cleaned up after her. So yes, Marilyn Monroe was dazzling, unforgettable, and magnetic, but behind the gloss, there was something raw and painfully human, and sometimes that humanity didn't smell so great. Frances Farmer was once one of Hollywood's brightest rising stars, talented, fiercely intelligent, and unwilling to play by the industry's rules. But as her mental health began to unravel, so too did something else, her attention to personal hygiene. By the time her career started to fall apart, people who worked with her behind the scenes noticed that Frances had completely stopped caring about basic cleanliness. She would show up to sets or rehearsals wearing the same clothes for days, sometimes with a smell that made others quietly step away. Hairdressers, costume designers, and even co-stars began to whisper about her condition, not out of cruelty, but concern. She seemed overwhelmed, distant, and noticeably unwashed. Some recalled that she looked like she hadn't bathed or changed in days, her clothes wrinkled, her hair undone, and a distinct odor clinging to her presence. Of course, none of this was spoken publicly at the time. Mental health was a taboo subject, and the studios worked hard to protect what was left of her image. But years later, in biographies, documentaries, and candid interviews, these stories resurfaced, not as gossip, but as part of a tragic portrait. Frances Farmer didn't smell bad because she didn't care. She smelled bad because she was fighting a silent war within herself, and no one in Hollywood was ready to help her. Her decline wasn't just emotional. It was physical, sensory, and very real for those who stood close enough to notice. Another reminder that behind the beauty and fame, there was a woman falling apart, and no one dared to say it out loud. Charles Laughton was a powerhouse of classical acting. His voice, his presence, and those intense eyes gave life to some of the most commanding characters in early cinema. But while his performances were polished, his personal hygiene, not always. Laughton was never the type to make tabloid headlines, and maybe that's why stories about his cleanliness flew under the radar for so long. But among Hollywood insiders, the makeup artists, the party guests, the fellow actors, there were whispers. Whispers that Lawton, for all his theatrical refinement, sometimes let the basics slide. One of the most bizarre tales comes from Hollywood's favorite gossip keeper, Scotty Bowers. He recalled seeing Lawton arrive at a cocktail party still wearing his full stage makeup, thick, heavy, and hours old. But what made it truly unforgettable? 4 days later, at another gathering, Lawton appeared again, wearing exactly the same makeup, smudged and cracked, as if it had never been removed. When questioned, gently of course, about still having makeup on, Lawton reportedly smiled and answered with dry wit, "Very observant of you, my dear," then turned away without another word. It left people wondering, was it laziness, eccentricity, or just defiance of Hollywood's polished expectations? Unlike others who drew more criticism, Lawton didn't smell bad exactly. But he was often described as having a perpetually unkempt appearance, as if grooming was a chore that simply didn't interest him much. There were mentions of the same clothes worn repeatedly, long gaps between showers, and that stubborn stage makeup that seemed to become part of his skin. Of course, in an era where image was everything, none of this ever saw print. Lawton was too respected, too revered, and frankly too complex to reduce to mere gossip. But when the memoirs and candid interviews of old Hollywood veterans began surfacing, so did these curious little details. He remains a legend of his craft, but off-screen, Charles Lawton carried a quiet reputation, not of scandal or disgrace, but of a man who at times preferred costumes to cleanliness. W.C. Fields made people laugh with his iconic nasal drawl and boozy on-screen persona, but stepped too close to him off-camera, and the experience was less amusing. Fields had a well-earned reputation for being one of Hollywood's heaviest drinkers, and with that lifestyle came a very specific scent, a mix of stale alcohol, sweat, and something you couldn't quite place, but definitely couldn't ignore. It wasn't that he never bathed. According to those who worked around him, it was more that he didn't prioritize it, especially after a long night out. He'd often show up to set still carrying the evidence of the previous evening, the smell of whiskey-soaked clothes, unbrushed teeth, and zero interest in freshening up. Crew members, especially those stuck in small enclosed spaces with him during shoots, remembered the smell vividly. It wasn't just body odor, it was liquid regret. And yet, nobody talked about it publicly at the time. W.C. Fields was a moneymaker. The studios protected their comedic stars as fiercely as their leading ladies. Bad breath, body odor, drunken stumbles, not for the public to know. But time, as always, brings things to the surface. In interviews years later, old colleagues recalled how difficult it could be to work near him. The smell was that persistent. And even when Fields wasn't drunk, the odor seemed to linger, like a character of its own following him from set to set. Of course, fans only saw the funny, clever, irritable Fields, never knowing that behind the camera, a can of cologne probably would have been more useful than a script. He was unforgettable. And according to those who worked with him, so was his scent. Wallace Beery was one of the most recognizable faces of 1930s and 40s Hollywood, always playing the gruff, no-nonsense character with a raspy voice and a hardened look. But it wasn't just his screen persona that made an impact. People remembered his smell. Those who worked around him, from assistants to camera crews, often said the same thing. You could sense Wallace Beery was nearby before he even stepped onto the set. Not because he was loud, not because he was larger than life, but because he carried a strong, distinct odor that suggested hygiene wasn't exactly his top priority. Now let's be clear, Beery wasn't considered filthy. No one accused him of being outright unclean, but he definitely wasn't a fan of overusing soap and water either. After a long day of filming, the scent of sweat and unwashed fabric would cling to him, and it wasn't something you could ignore in close quarters. In an era where studio heads carefully curated every aspect of a star's image, Beery's body odor wasn't something that ever reached the tabloids, but off the record, the stories flowed freely. Older crew members, once retired and far from the hush-hush contracts, described him as someone who brought the ruggedness of his roles into real life, smells included. There was no scandal, no dramatic exposé, just the quiet acknowledgement among those in the know. Working with Wallace Beery meant working nose first. He may not have had Clark Gable's polish or Errol Flynn's flair, but Beery left his own kind of mark on set, a lasting impression in more ways than one. Clara Bow was the face of the Roaring '20s, vibrant, magnetic, and bursting with energy. She wasn't just a movie star. She was the movie star, the original It Girl. But off camera, the glow faded, and according to those closest to her, the smells sometimes took over. Clara's personal life was chaotic, shaped by a troubled childhood, overwhelming fame, and ongoing emotional struggles. And in the midst of that chaos, Personal hygiene simply wasn't a priority. People who knew her privately later revealed that Beau would often go days without bathing, and her clothing sometimes carried the scent of days-old wear. She wasn't dirty in a careless way. She was overwhelmed. Her emotional and mental state, as those who studied her life later wrote, made it hard for her to maintain daily routines, especially the ones most stars clung to in public. The studios, of course, did everything possible to keep that image out of the spotlight. To the public, Clara Bow was perfect, but behind closed doors, she was often disheveled, exhausted, and yes, according to some, noticeably unclean. Friends described her home life as messy, with laundry piling up, rooms left in disorder, and a certain scent in the air that didn't match her glamorous image. At the time, nobody dared speak of it openly, and honestly, nobody wanted to ruin the magic she brought to the screen. But decades later, letters, memoirs, and interviews began to reveal a fuller, more human Clara Bow, a woman who gave everything to the screen and had very little left to take care of herself. Her charm was undeniable, her beauty legendary. But behind the makeup and the headlines, Clara Bow was a star struggling with a reality that didn't always smell like roses. John Barrymore was once hailed as one of the most magnetic actors of his time, a matinee idol with unmatched charisma and a stage presence that made audiences lean in. But in his later years, people leaned back, quite literally, because John Barrymore smelled. As his career began to fade and his personal demons took over, Barrymore's hygiene started to deteriorate dramatically. He was a heavy drinker, and as the alcohol took its toll on his health, so did his appearance and odor. Co-stars and crew members who worked with him near the end remembered not just a man in decline, but a man who no longer cared to bathe regularly, change his clothes, or present himself with the elegance he once embodied. One assistant stagehand, writing in his memoir years later, described how Barrymore could clear a room just by walking in, his presence marked not by applause, but by a thick, sour smell of alcohol, sweat, and neglect. Costumers whispered about unchanged wardrobe pieces worn over and over. Hairdressers noted grease and buildup that resisted combs, but while the press stayed silent, those in his orbit didn't forget. After Barrymore's death, former colleagues began to speak more freely. In interviews and memoirs, they remembered the sad transformation of a man once admired by millions, who by the end had all but given up on even the simplest routines of cleanliness. It wasn't vanity, it wasn't eccentricity, it was exhaustion, decay, and perhaps a kind of surrender. Peter Lorre had a screen presence like no other. With his haunting eyes and soft, eerie voice, he became a staple of noir films and psychological thrillers. But while audiences were captivated by his characters, those who worked with him were often distracted by something else entirely: the overpowering smell of old cigarette smoke. Lorre was a relentless chain smoker. Day and night, on set and off, he had a cigarette between his fingers, or a half-lit one smoldering in an ashtray nearby. Over time, it seemed the smoke didn't just cling to his clothes, it became part of him. Makeup artists and co-stars recalled how difficult it could be to spend long hours in close proximity. The scent was described as a thick wall of nicotine and stale tobacco, sometimes mixed with body odor from days when he appeared to skip showers entirely. One crew member even joked that standing next to Lorre during a full day of filming was like being trapped in a coat closet with a chimney. To be fair, Lorre battled ongoing stress and health issues, and it showed. He often appeared tired, worn down, and a bit unkempt, especially in his later years. And while no one ever accused him of being offensive in personality, his scent told a different story. Still, because of his talent and likability, few complained publicly. Studios knew better than to expose these backstage realities, and Lorre himself never addressed them. But decades later, in interviews and books about the Golden Age, these details surface, painting a vivid image of a man wrapped in mystery, smoke, and the lingering aroma of too many cigarettes. Spencer Tracy was the embodiment of dedication. On set, he was focused, serious, and utterly professional, one of the finest actors of his generation. But when it came to personal hygiene, that same dedication didn't always follow him into the dressing room. Stories from former crew members and makeup artists began surfacing years after his death, describing a man so immersed in his craft that he often forgot or simply ignored the basics. And it wasn't that Tracy didn't care. It was that he cared more about performance than presentation. He would sometimes show up to set in the same clothes he'd worn the day before, with the faint, and sometimes not so faint, odor of a man who had skipped a shower after a long shoot. One makeup artist who worked with him during Woman of the Year recalled how meticulous he was about his look for the camera. But once filming wrapped, His hair stayed unkempt, his clothes unchanged, and the scent of sweat and studio lights lingered around him. Another crew member on Guess Who's Coming to Dinner described Tracy as brilliant, but earthy, noting that while his acting was immaculate, his body often told a different story. Still, no one dared complain while he was alive. Tracy was a powerhouse, a two-time Oscar winner and deeply respected. But once the studio-controlled silence lifted, those who had worked alongside him felt more at ease sharing the details that never made the fan magazines. Spencer Tracy didn't mean to offend. He simply got lost in the work, often too absorbed in the character to remember the cologne. He was a star who gave everything to the performance, even if that meant a little less to the soap. Leo G. Carroll may not be a household name today, but if you've watched films like Rebecca or North by Northwest, you've seen his work. He was the kind of actor who brought quiet authority and a refined British air to his roles. But according to some old Hollywood crew members, that air wasn't always so refined up close. Unlike some of the more dramatic hygiene cases on this list, Carroll's wasn't the stuff of scandal. It was more of a subtle but consistent issue. As one retired lighting tech put it, Leo always looked sharp, until you were standing right next to him. The issue? He occasionally arrived on set with the scent of a man who'd skipped a bath or two. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. A tired combination of sweat, cologne that couldn't quite cover it, and maybe a jacket that had seen better days. In some cases, it was just the scent of someone who wasn't paying much attention to freshness, but not quite bad enough to cause alarm. It was the kind of thing that never made the papers, never sparked rumors, and certainly never damaged his reputation. But when the veterans of old Hollywood started telling their behind-the-scenes stories in interviews and memoirs, his name popped up. Quietly, and always with a knowing chuckle. Leo G. Carroll was a professional through and through, but even the most composed gentleman can forget a bar of soap now and then. And in the close quarters of classic film sets, even a faint aroma could become part of the legend. Tallulah Bankhead was a force of nature. A bold, unapologetic actress with a razor-sharp tongue and a wild streak that made her both admired and feared in equal measure. She broke rules, defied conventions, and lit up every room she walked into, but not always in a good way. According to people who worked with her, Bankhead had a notorious disdain for routine hygiene. She reportedly found bathing boring, a waste of time when there were parties to attend, people to shock, and drinks to pour. The result, a noticeable body odor that followed her into dressing rooms, onto stages, and occasionally even into social scandals. Unlike many stars who carefully curated their image, Tallulah didn't care what people thought. She smoked constantly, drank heavily, and reportedly saw deodorant as an unnecessary nuisance. Some co-stars and crew members whispered that being close to her for too long was a test of endurance. Not because of her sharp wit, but because of the scent that accompanied it. She once said, "My father warned me about men and booze, but he never mentioned a word about women and cocaine." That line alone sums up her rebellious spirit. And that same attitude applied to her grooming habits. Regular showers? Unlikely. Perfume, sometimes soap? Debatable. In her later years, stories began surfacing, from makeup artists, stagehands, and old friends, about the unmistakable odor that clung to her presence. It wasn't malicious, just memorable. One former stage technician summed it up perfectly. Tallulah didn't smell like a star. She smelled like someone who lived every second like it was the last. Hygiene be damned. She was loud, fearless, unforgettable, and by many accounts, one of the most defiantly unhygienic legends of the Golden Age.